the Cold War was certainly outstanding. We struggled mightily in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, suffered casualties. 36,000 Americans were killed in Korea. Over 58,000 were killed in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Americans understood the risks and the sacrifices that it took to defeat the Soviet Union. But the victory of the Soviet Union was not the victory over communism, and we're still fighting communism both in an external guise with the Chinese Communist Party, which is working to undermine our elections even as we speak, has been for many years. It's seeking to destroy American society, but also internally, where we have communists operating within the United States, working hand in glove sometimes with the Chinese Communist Party to overthrow it. So it's one fight against an external foe and an internal foe, but it's one enemy that we've been fighting for over 100 years.
It's really an important point. What would you say is the historical strategy, if you will, of communist movements inside the United inside of the United States, and what have they subverted and infiltrated inside of America in terms of our political institutions?
Well, that's so important because they've penetrated almost everything that matters from their perspective. Communists are experts at political warfare. They understand how to look at a society and know really which nodes to take over, which nodes to, as they call it, boring from within, penetrate and then slowly, gradually shift its orientation from a pro-American orientation towards a communist direction. So, Steve, typically they focused on what I call the ideas industry, our educational system, K through 12, and universities. And they successfully have taken those over, where we now have educational systems that are reflecting the priorities of these neo-Bolsheviks. The media also are so important to take over because the media frame ideas, they sustain them, and they're gatekeepers, allowing some ideas in and pushing other ideas out. So media are so important. Additionally, we could look at our political system and how the Democratic Party explicitly has been penetrated by communists, and now you have communists openly running. No longer furtive, they're no longer trying to hide what they're doing. They're proudly and openly running as communists, and that is alarming, an alarming development which underscores the point the Speaker was making, Speaker Johnson and President Trump, that this is an existential threat. It's an immediate threat today.
As we celebrate America's 250th birthday, how have communist ideologies shaped or distorted people's perception of the American identity?
It's a very important issue. If you recall Mandami's, New York City Mayor Zoran Mandami's speech on July 3rd, the morning of July 3rd, which was an interesting contrast to the speech that President Trump gave at Mount Rushmore that night, also on July 3rd. Mandami said that we have, in essence, the power to make America whatever we want it to be. And that's not the case. America is a very real thing with very real ideas, values, institutions, beliefs, a spirit that's animated by the spirit of 1776, and real beliefs. We could look at the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, etc. America is not something which is infinitely pliable. You're not able to define what it is if you don't like it. In contrast, President Trump gave an embrace, a full-throated roar in support of American identity, of American culture, and the spirit of 1776. So those two speeches are absolutely important. This is the ideological upheaval that we face in the United States today. Many folks wonder, well, why are our politics so contentious? Well, because you have communists coming into power around the country. And Mandami's explicitly saying what it is, right? He is doing a communist tactic, which is to seize a holiday and remake it, as they did with Christmas, for example, and other holidays in Russia, or as they do in China. You seize the holiday and you remake it in a communist light, and we can't have that. That's intolerable, and it's un-American, and it needs to be identified as such.
Now, Bradley, what do you say to folks perhaps some of the politicians out there that are being accused of being communists that sort of operate under the banner of democratic socialists, that there's a distinction, that, my label and my philosophy is different than communism, and this is just all scare tactics.
It's completely false, in my opinion. Communists, again, are expert. They're the New York Yankees of political warfare, right? They're really good at it, and they understand front organizations, whether that's George Soros and his son Alexander, with the innumerable front organizations that they run, or Neville Roy Singham in Shanghai, explicitly a communist who has, again, scores of front organizations that they use to advance their agenda, or Steve Jobs' widow. All of them are using front organizations because they recognize that their beliefs are absolutely unacceptable, and they are un-American, and they're incoherent when you actually look at those beliefs. So they use other organizations to advance their goals. Communists have always done that in the United States. For example, labor union fronts in the history of the communist movement, or other organizations that they have used, and they're doing that again today. Democratic Socialists of America is another example of it. It serves the interests. But Steve, I think we need to look to see where the heart of the beast is, to look at the Democratic Party, because that is where there's real muscle. That's where the brain, the muscle, and the nervous system really of these neo-Bolsheviks are placed.
Revolutions, movements like the Democratic Socialists of America, they're expensive. You mentioned some of these front organizations. Talk to us about the funding networks, including the NGO sort of ecosystem behind all of it.
Well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, backed by President Trump, of course, have been rolling that up in the State Department, right, where we're discovering, every day we're discovering new things about how corrupt that was. But we need to recognize that what the Soviets did, what Lenin did, was create a Comintern, a communist international, to spread the communist revolution worldwide. And in fact, the Comintern created the Chinese Communist Party and disciplined Americans to create the American Communist Party in the States. We don't have a Comintern today, but it's privatized, Steve. We now have George Soros and his son. We have, again, Neville Roy Singham. And they operate through many front organizations to fund these groups because they want the worse the better from their perspective, because they're neo-Bolsheviks at the end of the day. So the funding is absolutely important. Now, of course, that's going to be carefully hidden, and we'll go through many other elements. But we do see from the Southern Poverty Law Center and the investigations of the Southern Poverty Law Center that, in fact, at least in that instance, they didn't cover their tracks very well in terms of how they spent their money and abused it. So I think the U.S. government needs to look at this very closely, and Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, needs to look at this very closely to see where this money is going, and I think we'll see it's going back to the Soroses, the Singhams, but really also where are the Soroses and the Singhams getting support? The Chinese Communist Party.
That's the question I wanted to ask you. Neville Roy Singham, American businessman, very successful, billionaire, I believe he is, or very close to, but he lives in China. What sort of, I guess, hand in the pie does China have in all of this?
Well, you couldn't live as a billionaire in Shanghai without without having the approval of the Chinese Communist Party. That's by definition. So this is an individual who's working hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party for nefarious purposes from the standpoint of the health and well-being of the American people and the national security of the United States. This fellow is a direct threat to American national security. So he's working with the Chinese Communist Party, who's undermining us in every way, both domestically in the United States and also internationally. So that needs to be he should be famous, as an individual. As Armand Hammer was during the Cold War, as a scoundrel, right? Armand Hammer, with Occidental Petroleum, worked with the Soviets, right, to extract oil from the Soviet Union and sell it on the international line. So Armand Hammer was an American, but he was working with the Soviets, and most Americans, of course, rejected him, right, saw him as a traitor. as a scoundrel and as somebody who should not be part of polite society or any society. Singham needs to be seen in the same way, and so do Soros. And that's only going to come when you can actually get in there, if you will, lift up the hood of these many front organizations and see what's actually going on. When you understand communism, you recognize, again, that it's illegitimate. Look, this is just made out of whole cloth. These guys say, I've got a scientific understanding of society, and I'm going to take over your country. And I'll destroy whatever I need to destroy to do it. So, formidable threat. But at one level, it's an absurdity. Right? These guys have no legitimate reason to rule whatsoever. The Chinese Communist Party is a product of Soviet imperialism. The Soviets made the Chinese Communist Party. They put it into power, ultimately. It was Stalin who, as well as mistakes that Americans made at that time, that allowed the Chinese Communist Party to come to power. And it was still remained a product of the Soviet Union, of Soviet imperialism. We need to see it as such. Again, an illegitimate government. There's nothing legitimate about communists ruling in Beijing, put in place by the Soviet Union in an imperialist project. They're a colonial government, in essence. They're not Chinese. They have nothing to do with Han civilization, the greatness of Han civilization whatsoever, and that needs to be seen as such. It's a gang of thugs who are ruling in that country. With Xi Jinping, we see this, it's underscored every day. As this leader is taking the People's Republic of China in even ever more so a neo-Stalinist direction, with his emphasis on communist ideology, with his crackdowns, with his eliminations, firings through his quote-unquote anti-corruption campaign. This fellow should be seen as a neo-Stalinist. So when folks understand the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the hundreds of millions of people that they killed in famines, in wars, civil war, in wars, in famine, or in utero, obviously through forced abortions. The world should have nothing to do with this organization. It should be treated worse than apartheid South Africa during the Cold War, as beyond the pale, as not part of international society, and we shouldn't recognize them. So that, I think, is very important when you understand the illegitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And we look forward to the day when they're no longer in power and the Chinese people rule themselves.
Bradley Thayer, wonderful new book. Please tell us where we can get it and when it will be available.
Well, Steve, folks can get it wherever they buy books, Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and the official publication date is August 18th, 2026. Thank you so much, Steve.
8/18. Fantastic. Bradley Thayer, greatly appreciate you sitting down with us.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you.